Evelyn Carter stood in line at the Fort Hamilton commissary, her presence almost swallowed by the bright morning rush. The overhead lights washed out the colors in her jacket, a relic from another life. Olive green faded to khaki, threads unraveling along the sleeves. To most, it looked like something rescued from a thrift store, hardly the regalia of anyone worth remembering. That was all the young officers saw as they nudged each other, their whispers sharp as broken glass. "Probably looking for a handout," one muttered, not bothering to hide the smirk. Evelyn kept her gaze steady, ignoring the pitying glances from behind the counter. The cashier's voice was clipped when she asked for her veteran discount. "Sorry, ma'am, but we need real ID for that," the woman said, her tone hardening with suspicion. Another shopper in line scoffed loud enough for Evelyn to hear. These days, anyone can claim to be a hero. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was erasure. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Instinctively, her hand went to the worn patch above her heart, thumb pressing into the ghost of a symbol almost invisible now, but once feared and respected by those who knew. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the fabric, holding herself together. She wanted to speak, to correct them, but the words caught behind the years of secrets she'd sworn to keep. In that heavy pause, she wondered, how would you feel if your entire history was erased with a single word? Classified. Freeze there. Look into Evelyn's eyes. A storm of pain, pride, and memories that no uniform or ID card could ever capture. Will the truth behind her scars ever see daylight? Or will her story vanish, unrecognized? Have you ever been judged for what others see on the outside? Drop your story in the comments and subscribe to hear the truth behind the silence. Evelyn Carter's world had shrunk to a small, weathered house on the edge of Silverfield. Each morning, the Colorado wind brushed past the porch, rattling an old flag Evelyn hadn't taken down. Sometimes she stood outside with her coffee, watching sunlight touch the tips of distant mountains, letting herself remember a time when everything felt possible, when her family was whole and duty hadn't stolen so much. Inside, her home was an archive of memories. Photographs lined the mantel. Her wedding day, her daughter's first birthday, a faded shot of Evelyn and her husband in uniforms nobody else could name. In the living room, a child's drawing was taped to the fridge. A family of 3 stick figures with huge smiles. It was the last thing her daughter ever made for her before anger took root and silence stretched between them. The town itself was bustling. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Fort Hamilton, just a few miles away, pulsed with life. Fresh recruits in perfect uniforms, laughter echoing from barracks, a rhythm of boots and training drills that never really changed. But for someone like Evelyn, the distance between herself and that world was wider than any mountain range. Every letter from the VA felt heavier than the last. She'd learned to recognize the official envelopes. Always the same form letter, always the same words. "We regret to inform you." Unable to verify service. Insufficient documentation. No one at the administration could access her true record. Phantom Team didn't exist on any database. The missions Evelyn and her late husband had survived. The injuries that never quite healed. None of it was supposed to be real. And without proof, the bills piled up. The pain in her leg sharpened, and the world kept spinning. There were days she ached with a kind of grief no words could reach. Evelyn's husband, David, had never made it home from their final mission. His name was carved in stone at a military cemetery, but the real story was buried with him. Officially, he died in an accident overseas. The truth, how he'd covered their team's retreat so others could live, was something Evelyn carried alone. Their daughter, Julia, never forgave the army for stealing both her parents, first in years of absence, then in permanent loss. Now Julia lived in another state. Months passed between their calls. Some nights, Evelyn would find herself tracing the lines of the old patch on her jacket, her mind circling the same question. How many years of silence before sacrifice becomes invisible? She'd hold her husband's dog tags, let her thumb run across the engraved numbers, and wish she could tell someone the real story. Yet, through all the quiet and the ache, a stubborn fire kept Evelyn moving. She wanted only one thing: for the world to recognize what had been given, to admit that Phantom Team existed, that the price paid by David and herself had not vanished with a bureaucratic stamp. It wasn't about medals or glory. It was about healing, about Julia somewhere out there, maybe finding the pride that pain had taken away. Sometimes, after a long night, Evelyn would pull out an old photograph and the crayon drawing, laying them on the table. She'd remember the laughter before the long separations, the joy before the world got complicated. Sometimes she'd whisper into the quiet, "Sometimes the bravest battles are the ones no one's allowed to talk about." On the mornings when the weight felt crushing, Evelyn had a ritual. She'd slip her arms into the patched jacket, brush her hair back, and face her own reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Her eyes, lined with fatigue and resilience, met the gaze of someone who had carried on when giving up would have been easier. And every time she found just enough courage to step outside, ready to fight, one more time, in the only way she still could. The next morning, Evelyn braved the wind and the ache in her leg to face yet another appointment at the VA office. She'd come prepared, files organized, letters of commendation folded crisp, every supporting document she could possibly produce. The waiting room was full, humming with low voices and the shuffling of feet, soldiers and families in every stage of hope or exhaustion. Lisa, the clerk at the window, couldn't have been more than 25. She scrolled through Evelyn's paperwork, eyebrows rising. Phantom Team? Her tone was sharp, dismissive. Never heard of it. Was that like some experimental unit? There's nothing about it in the system? Evelyn tried to hold her composure. Most of what we did was classified. There should be a file number cross-referenced with... Lisa cut her off, lips curling in a half-smile. I'm sorry, Ms. Carter, but if it's not here, it doesn't exist. We get a lot of people claiming all sorts of secret service. Can you prove you served at all? A flush crept up Evelyn's neck. She set the dog tags on the counter, next to the old citation letter, but Lisa didn't even look. She stamped the denial form with an almost theatrical flourish, then slid it across the desk. Next. Her voice was so loud, the entire waiting area fell silent. Evelyn gathered her things as quietly as she could, but she could feel the stares on her back. Curiosity, suspicion, even amusement. Outside, the world spun on, indifferent. Each step to the car was heavier than the last. That evening, the humiliation followed her home, her inbox filled with messages she didn't want to read, most just spam. But one stood out, a link with the subject line, "You're famous." Someone had caught her leaving the commissary on their phone, the audio distorted but unmistakable, Lisa's voice echoing, "If it's not here, it doesn't exist." The caption underneath read, "Another stolen valor case exposed." Hundreds of comments piled on, some sneering, some angry, a few offering support. But those voices were quickly drowned out by mockery and threats. Evelyn stared at the screen, the old ache in her chest sharp as ever. For the first time in years, she unplugged her phone. She didn't want to know what else people would say. Not tonight. The next week, Evelyn's daily life narrowed even further. She kept her head down at the grocery store, timed her errands for when the shops were empty. The town that once felt like a quiet refuge now bristled with invisible landmines. Even on her walks, people she'd known for years crossed the street, eyes sliding away. The old jacket, the one she'd worn for comfort, now felt like a target. But Evelyn kept wearing it, out of defiance or maybe because she didn't have anything else that fit her anymore. One afternoon, there was a knock at her door. Mason stood on the porch, leaning heavily on his cane. He was nearly 80, his back permanently curved from a wound that never fully healed. But there was a dignity to him, an understanding in his eyes that few others shared. "I heard what happened at the VA," Mason said, voice gravelly. He handed her a tin of cookies, homemade, wrapped in a checkered towel. "They used to do the same thing to us, you know. When I got back from Vietnam, half the country thought we were villains. Took years for people to see us again." Evelyn tried to smile. "You'd think we'd learn after all this time." Mason looked at her, steady. "Some folks never will, but some of us do. You know that patch you wear? I recognized it, Phantom Team. My cousin served in ops. He said you people pulled off miracles no one could talk about. Said you saved a lot of lives." Her breath caught. "It wasn't just me, my husband. She couldn't finish. Mason patted her arm. "I know, some losses never leave you. But you're not alone, Evelyn. Not really." Later that week, Evelyn was called in for what was billed as a consultation. She arrived at Fort Hamilton, expecting another runaround with paperwork. Instead, she was ushered into a conference room by a brisk young lieutenant, Ethan Cooper, the same officer who'd led the online jeers. The room was full of junior officers, their expressions skeptical, some barely hiding their impatience. "We're reviewing protocols on field evacuation," Cooper announced, glancing at Evelyn's jacket with a faint smirk. "You served, right? Maybe you can give us some tips on, old-school techniques?" Evelyn felt the eyes on her, some genuinely curious, most dismissive. She looked at the slides projected on the wall, the familiar maps and plans. She recognized mistakes immediately, small flaws in timing or positioning, details you only learned under fire. She spoke up, soft but clear. "If you're clearing a corridor, you'll want 2 fallback points, not just one, and your evac team should always carry—" She was cut off mid-sentence. Another officer, barely older than her daughter, scoffed. "No offense, ma'am, but that's not how we do things now. We've got tech for that." The room erupted in quiet laughter. Evelyn stood, the shame and anger threatening to spill over. She met Cooper's gaze for a long moment. "You might be surprised how fast tech fails when the bullets start flying." He didn't respond. She left without another word, her jaw clenched, the weight of their scorn burning hot in her veins. That same day, Evelyn stopped by the PX for groceries. Near the register, she heard a commotion. Shouts, laughter, someone crying. A small crowd had gathered. At the center was a recruit, Jamie Lynn, hands trembling as a group of other soldiers hurled taunts. "You don't belong here," one spat. "Maybe you should just go home." Evelyn pushed through the crowd, standing between Jamie and the others. "Enough," she said, voice sharp. "That's not how we treat our own." The crowd stilled. A staff sergeant stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is military business. Civilians shouldn't interfere." Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. "I wore this uniform before most of you were born. and I'll never stand by while someone's broken down just for asking for help." For a moment, no one moved. Then, reluctantly, the staff sergeant backed off, herding the others away. Jamie Lynn stayed, eyes red but grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn offered a thin smile. "Don't let them take your strength. You earned your place here." But as soon as the crowd cleared, a captain approached, scowling. "You're out of line. Civilians aren't authorized to intervene." Evelyn didn't argue. She just walked away, her shoulders heavy, feeling more out of place than ever. That night, the silence in Evelyn's house pressed in on her. She sat at her kitchen table, medals and commendations spread out before her. She picked up a padded envelope, addressed to the Department of Defense, her fingers trembling. For a long time, she just stared at it. Was she really about to send away the last proof of who she'd been? She thought of Mason's words, of Jamie Lynn's eyes, of her husband's laughter echoing through time. She set the envelope aside, not ready to let go. Not yet. Morning broke cold and blue, the kind of Colorado day that felt hollow no matter how high the sun climbed. Evelyn walked the neighborhood loop, trying to outpace the memories nipping at her heels. Passing Mason's porch, she noticed his curtains closed, a rare sign. Concern prickled her. She dialed his number, but there was no answer. Later, she learned he'd been hospitalized overnight. Another neighbor brought the news. Pneumonia, touch and go. Suddenly, the world felt even emptier. Mason was the only one who'd believed her. Evelyn bundled up and made a pot of chicken soup, an old ritual for hard times. She scribbled a note, "Get better soon, or I'll have to storm the hospital myself," and left it with the thermos at the front desk. Back home, the weight settled on her shoulders once more. The humiliation, the online attacks, the institutional doors slamming in her face, each one cut deeper than the last. She let herself weep for a while, not bothering to hold back. For all the discipline a soldier learns, no one ever trains you for a war that doesn't end. That afternoon, the mail arrived with an envelope addressed in shaky handwriting. No return address. Inside was a photograph. 6 soldiers in desert gear, faces streaked with sweat and dirt, standing beside a battered helicopter. In the back, written in pencil, were the words, "Phantom Team. You're not forgotten. Stay strong." Evelyn's breath caught. She traced the faces, her husband, 2 friends lost, herself younger and fierce. A single tear landed on the edge of the photo, blurring the year, 2001. Underneath was a smaller envelope. Inside, a challenge coin she'd thought lost. Her old unit's symbol worn smooth with years. Someone out there remembered. Meanwhile, at Fort Hamilton, Mason was not wasting his time in a hospital bed. Using connections decades in the making, he reached out to a friend from his Marine days, now a senior officer in Army Command. He recounted Evelyn's story, her silent courage, the injustice done. "If anyone at the top still cares about honor," Mason wrote, "they'll find her file. She deserves to be seen." He didn't tell Evelyn what he'd done. Some debts were paid in silence. The next day, Evelyn received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the line was clipped, formal. "Ms. Carter, this is Colonel Walters at the base. I'd like to request your presence for a briefing on extraction protocols, scheduled tomorrow at 0900. No explanation, no questions, just an order." For a moment, she hesitated. She almost said no. But that night, she laid out her jacket, polished the old patch with a trembling thumb, and whispered a promise to herself. "One more time, David. I'll stand for us, whatever comes." The day of the briefing, Evelyn arrived early. The room was packed with officers, some she recognized from previous encounters. Their eyes tracked her as she entered, some with recognition, others with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Colonel Walters greeted her with a firm handshake. "Captain Carter, we appreciate your input today." He gestured for her to sit at the front, beside the whiteboard. For the first time in years, someone addressed her by rank. As the meeting began, Evelyn shared strategies that had saved lives in shadowy wars, details only someone who'd truly been there would know. She felt the skepticism shifting, grudging respect blooming as her advice cut through theory and into lived reality. Not everyone was convinced, but a few, Lieutenant Cooper among them, started to listen differently. Afterward, as the officers dispersed, Cooper hung back. His voice was low, unsteady. "Ma'am, I was out of line before. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. None of it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Sometimes, what we can't see is what matters most. Don't forget that." He nodded, eyes clouded. "I won't." At home that evening, Evelyn placed the photo and challenge coin next to her medals. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the tide was turning, but even as respect grew in pockets, the trolls online kept their voices loud. She received another threat, a message promising to expose the fraud. Fear mingled with exhaustion. She stood at her kitchen window, darkness pressing at the glass. She wondered if this fight was worth it, if the scars she bore were just hers to keep. That's when she found herself, once again, on the edge of surrender. The wind outside rattled the house. Evelyn gripped the countertop, shoulders trembling, and whispered, "Is it enough? Have I done enough?" In that moment, the challenge coin on the table glinted in a shaft of moonlight, as if to answer her. "No, you're not forgotten. Not yet." And with that, Evelyn steeled herself for one final stand, unaware that fate, and a reckoning she could never have imagined, waited just around the corner. The sky over Silverfield was sharp and cloudless when Evelyn made her way to the base commissary, the air brittle with a promise of winter. She walked slower than usual, every step weighted with decision. The battered grocery list in her pocket was just an excuse. She was there for Mason, to bring soup and fresh fruit to the hospital. But if she was honest, she was also there to say goodbye. Evelyn had made up her mind. When Mason got better, she would pack her things and disappear from Silverfield for good. She'd given all she could. The familiar faces at the base didn't smile or nod. Most glanced away, uncomfortable. Others stared openly, their expressions unchanged from that first day. Suspicion, dismissal. She kept her head high anyway. The old jacket zipped against the wind. The patch, nearly invisible after years of wear, was pinned close to her heart. Inside, the commissary pulsed with activity. Soldiers, families, the hum of voices and the rattle of shopping carts. Evelyn drifted along the aisles, lost in routine, eyes on the canned goods in the produce section. At checkout, she placed her basket on the counter, waiting for the cashier to ring her up. She didn't expect kindness, just a quick transaction, no questions, no scenes. But today, fate had other plans. A murmur spread from the entrance, followed by a sudden hush. General James Monroe entered with his staff, medals gleaming, his stride purposeful. He'd come to the base for a ceremony, nothing to do with Evelyn, at least not at first. But as he passed through the crowd, his gaze fell on her. For a second, his step faltered. He stared at the jacket, the barely there patch, as if seeing a ghost. Time seemed to contract. Monroe's hand rose in a silent command, halting his staff and drawing every eye in the room. He walked directly toward Evelyn. She felt the room freeze around her, heat rushing to her face, dread and confusion warring inside her. Had she done something wrong? Was this another accusation? Another humiliation? But Monroe's expression was different. Haunted, reverent. He stopped just feet from her. Then, in front of the stunned soldiers and civilians, he snapped to attention and delivered a perfect salute. The moment held, fragile as spun glass. Every sound died away. You could hear the faint whir of the refrigerator, the breath catching in someone's throat, a baby fussing far in the back. All eyes were on them. Monroe's voice was thick with emotion. I wouldn't be standing here if not for Captain Carter. I owe her my life. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The same people who had doubted Evelyn, whispered about her, now watched in disbelief. The young cashier dropped her scanner. Lisa, who had once dismissed Evelyn's service, shrank behind the register, her cheeks burning. Lieutenant Cooper, caught mid-step, froze, his online mockery echoing hollow in his mind. Evelyn's hands shook. She hadn't been called captain in years. She tried to speak, but the words tumbled out rough, barely above a whisper. We served so others could go home. That's all. Monroe's salute never wavered. He nodded, eyes glistening, the truth between them unspoken but undeniable. Slowly, other veterans in line straightened, some saluting, others simply nodding with respect. The mood of the room shifted, mockery dissolving, replaced by awe, remorse, a recognition long overdue. For Evelyn, the weight of decades pressed down all at once. Her legs trembled. Tears welled, blurring the sharp edges of reality. She tried to hold them back, but after so many years of swallowing pain, she finally let herself cry. Monroe stepped forward, gently steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. Your story will be heard, he promised, his voice for her alone, yet carrying to every corner of the room. The silence finally broke. A single voice began to clap, then another and another. The applause swelled, filling the commissary with something almost holy. Someone pulled out a phone, capturing the moment. This time, the video that went viral was one of honor, not shame. Word of the event swept through the base and into the world outside. Headlines didn't name every detail, classified was still classified. But the story of a forgotten veteran finally being recognized caught fire. Comments flooded in. From those who had served, from families of the missing, from strangers who saw a reflection of injustice finally made right. As the world watched, Evelyn Carter stood a little taller. For the first time in years, the scars on her heart felt seen, not just as wounds, but as proof she had mattered. After the applause faded and the last camera flash died, life at Fort Hamilton could never quite return to normal. There was a new awareness, a hush of humility, wherever Evelyn Carter walked. Some people averted their eyes, embarrassed by what they'd failed to see. Others sought her out, eager to offer apologies, their words awkward but sincere. Lisa, the young VA clerk, found Evelyn in the hospital waiting room a few days later. She stood nervously, twisting a memo pad in her hands. Ms. Carter, Captain Carter, I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I was just following policy, but I see now how wrong I was. I'm trying to make it right. Your file's being updated. Your service is finally being recognized. Evelyn nodded, seeing the genuine remorse in Lisa's eyes. Thank you. Not just for me, but for the next person who comes after. Make sure they don't have to fight so hard. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Cooper's shame cut deeper. He cornered Evelyn outside the commissary, his posture uncertain but earnest. "Ma'am, I was raised to respect those who served. I let arrogance get in the way. If you'd be willing, I'd like to learn from you. The real stuff, what they don't put in manuals." Evelyn studied him, a young man still searching for his own code. "Every mistake is a lesson, Lieutenant. What you do next matters more than what you did before." Slowly, quietly, word spread about Evelyn's rescue of Jamie Lynn, the new recruit. Some began to look at Evelyn as more than a figure of controversy, a mentor, a protector. Jamie herself sought Evelyn out, shy but determined. "I'm staying, Captain Carter, because of you." Evelyn smiled, a glint of pride in her tired eyes. "Then make it count, Jamie. Someone's always watching. Learn to stand for the ones who can't." Not everyone was quick to change. There were still skeptics, still some who doubted. At a command meeting, a skeptical colonel pressed Evelyn. "If Phantom Team was so real, why is there so little proof?" Evelyn didn't argue. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the battered challenge coin she'd received by anonymous mail. "Because some things," she said, holding the coin out for him to see, "were never meant for glory, only for the ones who carried the cost." A hush fell over the room as the colonel recognized the coin's true significance. No more questions were asked. As the weeks passed, Monroe and the base command invited Evelyn to help design a new training program, one focused on the ethics and realities of unseen service. She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to stay, but Mason, still recovering, ever stubborn, urged her on. "You want to honor your team? Teach them what real courage looks like." It was the first time in years Evelyn felt needed, not as a relic, but as a guide. She stood before young recruits and shared what no textbook could teach: the cost of silence, the burden of memory, the value of compassion in the heat of chaos. At home, she dusted off the framed photo of her family. She called Julia, her daughter, unsure if the call would even be answered. But Julia picked up. There was a long pause, then tears, apologies, the slow and painful work of mending what war and misunderstanding had broken. The video of Monroe's salute lived on, not just online, but in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Its message was simple. Dignity can be stolen, but it can also be returned if someone is brave enough to see. Spring returned to Silverfield quietly, coaxing green from the hills and a hint of hope from the cracks in old scars. At the base, a new ceremony was planned, one that, for the first time, included a tribute to Phantom Team and the invisible hands who'd shaped the fortunes of so many. Evelyn Carter stood at the heart of it all, no longer in the shadows, but not quite comfortable in the spotlight either. She wore her jacket proudly, the patch now restored and shining against the cloth. At her side, Jamie Lynn, no longer the nervous recruit, but a young woman standing straight, her eyes full of promise. General Monroe led the proceedings, his voice steady as he read aloud the names of those who'd never come home. As the final name echoed, Monroe turned to Evelyn. "On behalf of everyone who made it back, and all those who never could, we thank you." Evelyn's hands shook only slightly as she removed her old Phantom Team patch, pinning it on Jamie's uniform. "You carry this now," she said, her voice strong but gentle. "Not for what it means on the outside, but for what it demands of you on the inside. Lead with courage. Stand for those who can't." Jamie's eyes shone with unshed tears. She saluted. Around them a hush fell, a reverence not for glory, but for what had been endured and survived. After the ceremony, Evelyn lingered near the memorial wall, Her fingers traced the etched letters of her husband's name, David Carter. She let the silence settle, memories rising and falling like the tide. "We're finally seen, love," she whispered. "It took the world a while, but they finally see." As the sun dipped low, Mason arrived with his cane, stubborn as ever. "You did it, Evelyn. You gave them back their story, and you gave us all a reason to remember." Evelyn turned, a real smile spreading across her face. For the first time, the weight she carried felt lighter, as if she was finally allowed to set it down, if only for a moment. At home that evening, Julia called. Mother and daughter spoke for hours. Laughter, confessions, the slow stitching together of a family nearly lost to time and grief. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Julia finally said. "I always was. I just needed to understand." Evelyn let that sink in. Some battles take a lifetime. Weeks later, in her first training session, Evelyn faced a new class of officers. She looked out over a sea of young faces, some skeptical, some eager, all waiting to be shaped. "You'll be judged," she told them, "by people who don't know your story. There will be days you feel invisible, maybe even worthless. But you'll keep going, not for medals, not for praise, but because someone somewhere is counting on you." She paused, letting her words settle. And if you ever wonder what difference one voice can make, remember, sometimes the world only needs one person to see the truth. Now, as evening fell and Evelyn watched the sun burnish the peaks outside her window, she thought about legacies, the ones we inherit and the ones we choose to leave behind. She wasn't alone anymore. Neither were her memories. So let me ask you, yes, you watching right now, have you ever known someone whose story was almost lost? Someone who carried their burdens in silence, waiting for someone to notice? If you could, what would you say to them now? Share your thoughts below. Honor their truth. And if Evelyn's journey moved you, subscribe, share this story, and help us keep the light shining for those whose courage lives in the quiet spaces. Their stories are not over. They live on, in you, in all of us.